Mr. Alexiam.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, fake news is not new. Deliberate disinformation has been part of statecraft for centuries. Singapore has experienced our own tragic effect of disinformation in our early days, and I'll quote two examples. The first is the communist threat. Early propagandists like Tan Malaka, who hailed from Indonesia, he was an agent of the Comintern. Arriving into Malaya in the 1920s, he invited the Chinese Communist Party to send agents into Malaya in 1925. And that marked the beginnings of the early stages of the Malayan Communist Party, or the CPM. The CPM grew by leaps and bounds in terms of membership during the Second World War. They launched the communist struggle at the end of the Japanese occupation, and thus began the Malayan emergency. Disinformation and propaganda of falsehoods supported by communists in the region were widespread all the way until the 1980s. This entire experience with the communists led to 13,000 deaths, over 13,000 deaths over a course of 12 years, ending only in 1960. Subsequently, they went underground, but continued to destabilize young nations of Malaysia and Singapore. In 1964, we had the race riots. It was a tragic and yet pivotal moment in our history, one that's seared into our psyche. Yet, though we call it a race riot, it was the weaponization of political narrative that led to the unfortunate incidents. Its background is not unknown to us. Many have studied it. Key of which was a political disagreement between the Alliance Federal Government in Malaysia and the People's Action Party government in Singapore. UMNO at that time led a campaign through Utusan Melayu, which was a Jawi-based newspaper. Disinformation articles in Jawi manipulating the words of Singapore leaders were widespread. An example of which is this article from 17th of July 1964, very soon before the riots took place. Established facts that were untrue about our leaders. It spoke about the Singapore leadership intentions to oppress Malay rights. Clarifications were made by Singapore leaders, but clarifications were not published by the paper. There were further deliberate disinformation campaigns. A series of leaflets were issued calling for Chinese to be killed in Singapore. In one paragraph, it said we should wipe out all the Chinese from Singapore to prevent them from making fools of us. Material like that inflamed tensions between communities. On top of that, you had further inflammatory speeches by people such as the Secretary General of UMNO, Syed Jafar Alba. One thing led to another and created a climate of fear and distrust. What would have been a small incident during the procession on Prophet Muhammad's birthday became that spark on an entire pile of tinder that exploded. Deaths, injuries, destruction. Not just lives and infrastructure, but society itself. However, we survived it and we thrived. But will we be as lucky the next time? Today, this bill gives us the capability that we lacked then to put out clarifications, corrections, fast, accurately, and widely. We may choose to speak philosophically about it, but when lives depend on accurate information that needs to be out there urgently, we will be want to be philosophical about it. Let's look at Ukraine today. It's subject to a daily barrage of disinformation to destabilize the country, further divide the Russian-speaking population, the minorities there, and the majority Ukrainians. As an example, a pro-Russian fake news website circulated an article that the press service of the Ministry of State of Security in the Donetsk People's Republic reported that the Ukrainian forces were preparing a provocation in Donbass. This was when an EU delegation was due to visit. The DPR ministry claims to have uncovered Ukrainian forces' plans to use a missile to shoot down the delegation's helicopter and blame it on the DPR rebels. This is just one example of the daily barrage that they have to go through. The Select Committee has reported on how falsehoods have been weaponized by some countries. Minister, in his opening speech yesterday, spoke about non-kinetic warfare to harm the sovereignty and social resilience of other nation-states. Dr. Sashish Jayakumar of the RSIS presented before the Select Committee, and he shared on how disinformation operations involve, and I quote, spreading rumors to discredit politicians and playing out themes like negative portrayal of immigration policy that have been aimed at undermining public trust towards democracy, and systematically influencing populations to become less trusting of mainstream established news network and more trusting of fringe news sources backed by foreign powers, and conspiracy narratives, end quotation. We must realize that this is not a theoretical possibility. It's not one that is far removed from our shores. The Select Committee has received expert evidence of foreign state-linked disinformation already present in Singapore. And this makes complete sense. We are a nation that is open and connected and diverse, and therefore is the perfect target for disinformation operations as part of a larger influence operations to wear down our people. And I return to my earlier starting point, that disinformation is not new. Then what makes it so different now that we require new and robust laws? Retired US Air Force intelligence colonel John Herman describes what's known as the V3S3 of weaponized narratives: vector, vulnerability, virulence, scope, speed, and synergy. Traditional vectors in traditional warfare are physical weapons, but they have limitations of reach and cost. Falsehoods, however, as weaponized narratives and disinformation, are unconstrained by physical bunkers of hiding spots. It has a global blast radius that self-propagates after launch. Vulnerability traditionally meant how much of a bombardment you can take before physical resistance succumbs. Today, it's easy to get past cognitive resistance. It exploits our weaknesses and our biasness. Virulence today should be no surprise as well, because fake news and falsehoods spread faster and wider than any given chemical weapons. The scope and speed by which falsehoods spread when digital technology costs so much less than bullets, ammunition that self-replicates through bots and online armies, what some refer to as the fire hose of falsehood, the deluge that comes towards you. And of course, synergy, when disinformation builds up one on another, confusing first, confounding, and then eventually convincing the population. So even traditional disinformation campaigns have evolved. And I think we can all agree that such state-sponsored disinformation campaigns need speed, accuracy, and clarity, wide distribution, and inoculation to combat. And therefore, the executive is best placed in this situation to make a call for national security. There will be some who say, why not? Let's take a middle ground. While some falsehoods will require swift action, the same urgency should not extend to other kinds of falsehoods. For example, drip-feed falsehoods. But against this backdrop, the assertion that some drip-feed falsehoods should not require swift actions is misconceived. It is precisely drip-feed falsehoods that are the weapons of choice of state-linked actors today. Gradual, insidious effect can take root deep in the population's psyche. Without a speedy reaction, it can be very difficult to remedy. In this line, I wish to make a point on the final limb that's proposed in this legislation. Some have expressed concerns over this, that of undermining public confidence in the government and other agencies, and some say that the definition of public interest is far too wide. However, given the expert evidence on disinformation operations, especially those that are already apparent in Singapore, it is clear why this ground is needed. It is important that the exercise of power remains subject to clear check and balance. I think we must accept it. But this bill does provide for it and has been emphasized by the Minister and many others who have spoken about it. Disinformation campaigns, weaponized narratives all serve as this new front, and we must all be prepared. To better inform the public on why POFMA is of particular importance to combat such foreign campaigns, I ask that the Minister share more on how the bill serves as a counter to state-linked campaigns run against us, and to prepare and inoculate our people against such disinformation that seeks to divide our population. Coming back to my example of the communist threat in the early years, some younger residents that I spoke to recently asked, what will be the status of academic research? For example, historians writing papers on research into Operation Coastal. Research that asks if there was ever a communist threat, if there were ever any communists in Singapore at all. I think these are honest questions, and I'm thankful that Minister Ong, as Minister of Education, has spoke succinctly on this, what the bill encompasses and what it does not, especially when it comes to academia. Much has also been said about the directions by the minister or ministers, whether to correct or to take down. Some say that the direction is like a beheading. It serves as a tool to permanently silence the discussion. This, I think, grossly misconstrues what the directions set out to do. Far from silencing discourse, I submit that it adds to it. In fact, as it stands, even after a correction, the original poster can still comment on it. So can journalists, so can academics, so can any man in the street. When a minister gives a correction or take down directions, he is required to give reasons on why a statement of fact is false. So far from reducing the discourse, it adds to it. More importantly, it certainly does not silence. In fact, after a takedown, the person is free to continue posting on any other matter. To say that the directions will silence discourse ignores that the discourse will now be more complete because it will have both viewpoints. It is up to the public to decide, with the availability of both viewpoints, what is right or what is wrong. Mr. Deputy Speaker, this is an important and much needed piece of legislation. We are under threat from outside actors, and that is something that requires robust measures to safeguard Singapore and Singaporeans, and that is why I support this bill.